could have heard this episode 40, well, actually, you can hear this episode right now because you're listening to it right now. As for the first time in a long time, this episode is going up at the same time on all of our platforms. Same time with a little asterisk because sometimes they get a little delayed on the non-YouTube and non-Patreon platforms because of our old-ass RSS feed. That being said, hey, not doing the usual intro I do on this because, again, this episode is going up at the same time everywhere because today is December 22nd, 2024. At least it's not that right now, but when you're hearing this, hopefully it is December 22nd, 2024. That is the day of the upload on all of our platforms because on December 22nd, 2014, the Indieheads podcast premiered its first episode on youtube.com. And so, hey, in case you can't do math, that means that today is the 10-year anniversary of the Indieheads podcast. We're celebrating 10 years. Which is crazy to think. It is crazy to think that we've been doing this podcast for this long. But I'll go on my little spiel. I'll go on my little thing about it later on in the episode as I'm here to explain what the episode is. But before I explain the episode you're hearing, hey, I'm still going to shout out our Patreon supporters as without our Patreon supporters, this podcast does not happen because hey, it is a little pricey to have a podcast going it's a little pricey to have a podcast, with the way that we do things. So we thank our Patreon supporters so much for, supporting the podcast every month. Again, we really could not do it without you all. And the you all in question here is the following names, which are Becca Etienne, Georgia Mikowski, James Boss, Marcy Anime, Delaney Mothman, Josiah Duncan, Jenna, Matt Cameron, History of Violet, Joseph Duratani, Connie, Javon Clement, Jimmy Alward, Three Twist Balloon Dog, Charles, Nicole Rifkin, Tim's Discount Prices, Heath and Catherine, Jay, Rena, Ian, Matthew Taylor, I Like Books, Sarah Moore, Griff, Max Kapazinski, Mark Berry, Cal 50, Dr. Penis Hoagie, PhD, yeah, Chris Wade, Midwest Maxwell, Jake Wald, Grant, Keep Autism Reared, Rob Marino, Max, Zach, Gavin 490 Freak, Amber, and Maze Farms. And those are our real ones. Those are those that support us for $5 a month or more on patreon.com. And these are people that are getting our bonus episodes every month. So, hey, if you want to receive one bonus episode every month, of course, we put out about 4 podcasts a month because that is the way we operate. And our episodes, they get pretty long at times. So I think, we get you 4 solid episodes every month. And one of those goes exclusively to our Real One supporters on patreon.com/indieheads podcast. So, hey, if you like bumping up that Patreon subscription or subscribing in general, hey, $5 a month. I think that's the best bang for your buck, as not only you get those bonus episodes, you get the rest of our episodes 48 hours early, you get into our Discord server, and you get yourself an Indieheads podcast sticker, as I just printed out a bunch of new ones that I am slowly but surely mailing out to new supporters and people that just want stickers. So, hey, you want a sticker? $1 a month gets you that and gets the episodes early and gets you in the Discord server. But we have more people to thank, of course, as we have the rest of our Patreon supporters to thank, like Jason Daphnis, Kevin Cookman, A. Watt, Ali Eleanor, Chedas, Nate O, Eric Chow, Josh, Holiday Kirk, Tyrone Truhan, Drew Wharton, Jane Namjani, Chance Holdup, Alexis Davin, Cody Gagan, Barely March, Minka LaFleur, Will Griffin, Corbin Camage, Gavin, Matthew, Ethan Sapir, Matthew McPherson, Randy Donaldson, Eleanor Grams, Wilfer Thrill, GS420, Willie, Jacqueline Kadiga, Alec Felder, Talks of Trees, Molly O'Brien, AJ Moser, Eraser Eye Baby, Matthew Herring, Jack Tiggleman, Sarah L., Jeremy Bull, Alex Gershmanoff, and Derek Pemberton. And one name in there to remember is Mr. AJ Moser, as he'll be first up on this episode talking about his favorite album released in the last 10 years. So from December 22nd, 2014 until December 22nd, 2024, what is your favorite album released in that time? And ideally, it's an album you discovered because of the Indieheads podcast. I know we don't talk about new music a whole lot these days, but new music is still very important for the lot of us on the podcast, as of course next week's episode will be our album of the year special. And again, it's a question that I wanted to ask various cast members and friends of the podcast, like, hey, what has been your favorite album released in that time period? And ideally, it's an album you discovered because, of us on the Indieheads podcast. It was just a question, just a personal curiosity of mine. And I'm very glad that we have some people that have answered that question, as you'll be hearing from them throughout the episode. And also me, I'll be answering that question too. But up first, of course, is Mr. AJ Moser, who is one of the few day one OG Indieheads podcast members that is still a cast member to this day, as he is one of the 5 guests on the first episode. That also includes myself, Jeremiah, Nick, and Alex. Not that Alex, a different Alex, the original Alex before our beautiful Alex, who you of course heard all throughout the number 1 series in 5 Morons, and of course one of our just one of our finest members in the Indieheads podcast history is that Alex, not the one that's on that episode. And no insult to the Alex that's on the first episode, which by the way, the first episode, don't listen to it. Don't listen to it. It's bad. It's really bad. I'm ashamed of that episode. Not because we said offensive stuff. No, it's like the quality's terrible. We have no idea what we're doing. It literally took us, there's some podcasts that are able to get on the ground running, right away. For us, it took a long time for us to kind of figure out what we were and kind of, get on the floor running. It's not really until 2020 where we kind of figure out this is how we should do things, huh? Okay, all right, yeah, huh? But of course, AJ Moser is up first on the docket to talk about his favorite album released in the last 10 years, and maybe how it connects to the Indieheads podcast. So, Mr. AJ Moser, take it away.
Hello, Marty and the Indieheads podcast community. This is AJ Moser speaking. And I'm reflecting on how it's probably 10 years to the day at the time of recording when I was in my parents' basement on the very first episode of the Indieheads podcast, the best albums of 2014. And now here I am in my parents' attic recording a transmission for our decade episode. Who'd have thought we made it out the Reddit forums and over here? The assignment of what to talk about within this window was racking my brain, and of course also thinking about a recent poll going around X.com, the everything app, about the best artists to have emerged post 1999 in the 21st century with the most impressive discography. And in both instances, there's really only one serious contender that I can think to include, and that's of course the monumental 2016 album by Japanese Breakfast, Psycho Pump, and the subsequent domination of all entertainment industries by Michelle Zauner, including 2 great additional Japanese Breakfast albums, the soundtrack to the video game Sable, and Crying in H Mart, which is, I think, probably bigger than everything I just talked about by a significant margin. Now, Psycho Pump's an album I'm sure within the listener base needs no introduction. 26 minutes of the most perfect and powerful indie pop you are likely to hear in your entire life. And the Japanese Breakfast live experience is something that, speaking to the podcast and the recently departed Pitchfork Music Festival, is something that's so essential as a foundation. In these past 10 years, I think myself, I've been to something like 25 Japanese Breakfast shows, truly just one of the most important artists of our time. But the immersion of Psycho Pump was sort of a critical moment for the podcast and our organization as a community. It felt like a genuine discovery, sending a lightning bolt through our Skype chats, as has been documented in the greatest Reddit post of all time. and something that was truly sort of compelling, I think a moment of pride for us as a journalistic forum to shine a light on this incredible album and say, this is, important, worthy of conversation, and something we're not simply going to allow to fade away. So that's one of my fondest memories still. And, one of the most important albums of my lifetime. So it had to be, it had to be. It's crazy to think how things have changed and transformed over these past 10 years. There is still a podcast, and it does ostensibly talk about music, but what I have found the most value in from, these folks in this community over time is the valence with which we dissect and consume art and all of the many ways it seeps its way into our lives, from the discovery of really crucial guys lost to time, emerging boy bands and punk girls from all walks of life. I think what I take the most pride in, and I hope you all do as well, is the people we've brought together and the conversations that we've had in these past 10 years. So hopefully that's something that continues to grow over time. I talk to you motherfuckers every day, so I'm sure it will. But what a wonderful thing to be here celebrating. And before I sign off, I just want to clear the air that I do not have a thing for puppets at all, and that was completely overblown. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mr. AJ Moser, for that clip. Of course, yeah, Psychopomp, I mean, again, it's not forgotten to time, of course, but, it is important to remember, hey, the domino of So AJ does lead us to the eventual Crying in H Mart movie that's going to win at least one Oscar. I do think at least it will win one Oscar if Amazon, MGM, Orion plays their cards right. But thank you, AJ. Of course, again, AJ, really cannot be said. Again, he is on the first episode of the podcast, is, again, one of my I have been friends with AJ Moser for longer than I've been friends with a lot of people. I love AJ to death. And, but in AJ, we're all your friends. We love you to death. You don't have to lie about the puppet thing. If you're into puppets, nobody's going to shame you. All right. Nobody's going to shame you. You don't have to cap, AJ. You don't have to, but, let's keep it moving. So I think the way that we're going to structure this is we're going to do a cast member and then a friend of the pod. And we've made a lot of friends of the pod over the years, and we're going to talk about, we're going to let a recent friend of the pod talk about the pod and an album. Can you tell that I'm recording this right now? It is 11:54 on a Friday, so I'm a little loose recording at least the first batch of these for the episode. But a recent friend of the podcast, recent friend, but also kind of a longtime friend, Devon Chosen, who of course you heard throughout a couple of Best New Pod episodes this season, and we'll be back for the Shoulda Beens for Jackie's Shoulda Beens episode. Devin, of course, dear friend, we have been mutuals for a very long time. Was very, very happy to finally have him on the podcast this year. So from Devin, let's hear it.
Congratulations, Indieheads podcast, on 10 magnificent years. This is Devon, recent guest on Best New Pod. Proud to be a friend of the Indieheads podcast universe. Proud to indulge in a number of your different series over the years. I have a huge soft spot for car commercial number ones, and I would love to shout out a particular album that came from the Indieheads universe, Pink Balloons by Echo Astral. Shout out to Jackie. A lot of this is, of course, tied up in some wonderful memories I have of meeting many of the indie heads at Pitchfork a couple of years back, and meeting a number of them with JL, who had come up from DC to indulge in that magnificent festival that we now have to bid adieu to. This was an album that I will not pretend I was not nervous about. I love having friends who are musicians, but it's always a bit of a challenge to have connections who are musicians when you're a critic, because you can absolutely say whatever you want about somebody's album, but somebody's really looking to you for their opinion. And I can say with confidence that Pink Balloons is one of those albums that has reinvigorated my interest in more familiar varieties of punk. It is the kind of noise rock album that synthesizes some of the best of my favorites in this space, whether it's a Gilla band or a Thinking About the Heyday of Priests, anything of the sort. But with a really fresh perspective that JL and her bandmates have brought to this kind of music, really adding a lot of unique beltway-isms that I think give them a lot of verisimilitude, and just the riffs are peak. JL can work a crowd like no other, whether that is in recorded form or on the stage. So thank you, Indieheads podcast universe, for introducing me to Echo Astral. Thank you for introducing me to JL, who I now am fortunate enough to consider a friend. We nerd out about energy issues because I took a couple classes on energy management when I was in grad school. So fun little intersections that come when you intersect your life with podcasters. And if there's anyone who should know anything about hanging out with podcasters too much, I suppose it would be me, boyfriend of the podcast Endless Scroll. Congratulations, Indie Heads. Have fun. Take care.
Thank you very much, Devon, for your very, very kind words. And yeah, of course, Devon, again, as I said, longtime friend of the pod, but only a very recent guest. And hopefully we'll be guesting on much more episodes throughout 2025. So Devon, if you're listening to this, just if you like reality show stuff, if I see an episode, I'm like, ooh, Devon would be a good fit, I will reach out. In that case, though, let's keep it moving. Let's go back to a cast member of the Indieheads podcast. Let's go for another longtime cast member, although now down to front of the pod status due to their request, but still someone that was a very early cast member and someone that is still very, very involved in the Indieheads podcast community. I'm, of course, talking about Lily. And Lily, of course, longtime dear friend and someone whose taste and opinions that I respect very, very much. Probably one of the smartest people, and that's not an insult. We have a lot of very smart people that are on the Indieheads podcast. In terms of music, Lily is one of our smartest. Someone that I was always very, very impressed with the way that they wrote, and just the breadth of their knowledge and their taste and all that stuff. So I'm very excited to hear what Lily has to say on this episode. So, hey, let's go to Lily.
Hello, and happy 10th birthday, Indieheads podcast. Lily here, making my belated return to the mic after, I think, a 2-year hiatus. Has it been that long already? Jesus Christ. Anyways. To the surprise of absolutely no one, as my favorite album released since the beginning of this podcast, I have to select Thank You by Black Dresses. I knew this was my answer pretty much the moment I saw the prompt, but the more I've thought about it, the more I think it's very fitting that this happens to be a record released at the exact midpoint of this podcast's lifespan. Because to me, it's an album that crystallized a number of musical forces that were percolating during the first half of our existence. And it's an album that anticipated a number of the cultural forces that would define the second half of our existence. And not only does it act as this bridge between eras of this podcast, but I think between the end of the 2010s and the beginning of the 2020s as well. The combination of dissonant lo-fi production, the reclamation of ironic 90s snark and eclectic 2000s mallcore influences, and nu metal, the sense of humor, the fatalistic worldview of this record. These are all things that were certainly in the ether prior to it, but I think that Black Dresses perfected it in a way that read as alien to a lot of people at the time. But these would all go on to be among the defining musical characteristics of the 2020s, and I think Thank You now reads as this throwing of the gauntlet for what would follow it. We were talking not long ago about the influence of Sophie and the fact that, like, you don't get Brap without Bip. And I don't think you get this effective mainstreaming of noisy, experimental, queer-led pop music without Thank You and Black Dresses either. And while their immediate influence may be felt in more mainstream adjacent spaces, to me there's no denying that it exists across the board. And on a personal level, this album was the closest I ever came to my own psychopomp moment on this podcast, where I happened to encounter this band that hardly anyone was paying attention to and had this gut feeling of like, oh, this is something really extraordinary that people need to be listening to. And for reasons beyond ego, it was extremely vindicating to watch that instinct be validated over the years to come and to see this band get to where they really deserve to be, in part, I hope, because of the influence of this podcast. It was such a privilege to get a front row seat to the entire trajectory of this band and watch people begin to rally around them in a way this small handful of us hoped they would at the outset of their careers. I remember the first couple times I saw them live thinking that this was the closest I'd ever get to the experience of stumbling into a Velvet Underground show in 1965, where it was like, oh, there's 12 people here and all of them are going to go on to do something of consequence because of this. And there would turn out to be a lot of truth to that feeling. And I'm really grateful I got to be at the epicenter of something like that. It was one of the coolest things that has happened to me over the course of being part of the show. In hindsight, I'm really fascinated by how much of this album's legacy would end up being shaped purely by the winds of fate. I remember when I was trying to push it on people at the time, there was this attitude of like, oh, I'm too cisgender to understand this. And like, why does it sound like that? Why do they sing like that? Why are they being so scary? But at its core, this is a record about loneliness, mental illness, poverty, violence, fascism, climate collapse, despair, and the struggle to find hope amidst all those forces. And for as unrelatable as the lyrical extremes of this album may have felt to most people in February 2019, by the summer of 2020, 18 months later, there wasn't a person on Earth who wasn't dealing with all of those things on a very immediate level. It was front of mind for all of us. And it so happened that the culture really came around to meet this record where it was at. And I think that's only become even more the case since. There's hardly been a day in the last 15 months where the line, if everything is dying, I'll just look away, hasn't rattled around in my head at some point. I wish we had the time to talk it out, but we don't have the time, as they kill us all over and over when they never had the right. What did they know and when did they know it? They really tapped into something wildly specific and unusual, both sonically and thematically. And that would go on to become part of the cultural standard in the years that followed. I think this record, to me, is also most indicative of how the identity and the constitution of this podcast has changed in the last 10 years. When it came out, I was still the only out or queer trans person on this podcast. And not long after that had entirely changed. We started out as these idiot kids, literal children, who hardly understood ourselves or our place in the world. And we really grew into something else entirely, both on an individual level and as a unit. And for me, looking back, Thank You marks the point where that really began to happen. You can look to me screaming about black dresses in 2018, 2019, and everyone else in the chat being like, huh? To us making Forever in Your Heart our album of the year in 2021 as a real embodiment of that change, I think. In the time between those two albums, we'd become unrecognizable both as people and as a podcast in the best possible way. And the trajectory of Black Dresses really mirrors that to me, where they emerged into a world that entirely lacked the context to understand what they were doing. And you saw that context get built up around them, where they became the celebrated and influential band they deserved to be. So not only do I love this album for the inventive, razor-sharp songwriting, the aggro, bricked-out production, Devian Rook's acrobatic vocal interplay, its playfulness, and sort of meta wink-wink, nudge-nudgeness of the ad-libs, and the really prescient lyrical poignancy. I also love what it symbolizes in terms of a real turning of the page in the journey of doing this podcast together, and the beginning of us shifting from what we started out as to what we are now. It lies at the center of so many things, both on a personal and cultural level, and represents so much of what we've achieved in these last 10 years as a group of friends and as a show. And I'm as grateful to it as I am to all of you. All right, I gotta go to a Jackass 3D screening now. Love you all. Bye.
Thank you very much, Lily. It is, like I said, Black Dresses, the first time I heard about Black Dresses was from Lily and the podcast in general, as sort of watching slowly over the course of like a year, like more and more people on the cast get into that band. Sadly, it was never for me. It was one of the cisgender people that she is talking about. I am one of those, which was probably my take at the time. Probably wouldn't be my take anymore. But yeah, it was kind of crazy to watch. Like 2 or 3 years later, like seeing like Fantano and Rate Your Music get onto Black Dresses. It was like, oh shit, it happened again. Like when we were getting really into Psychopomp, like, oh shit, it happened again. We were just like so early to what would become, a bit of a phenomenon. Although obviously Black Dresses, the little brief touch of internet fame, and they're like, oh nope, and they kind of purposely pushed away from it. Whereas Jay Brecky, like they got a taste, and they're like, all right, let's keep moving forward. And there is in both scenarios very valid. Like I just got to say that for the record. But yeah, let's go once again to a friend of the podcast. I'm trying to debate like who should go after Lily. And for me, let's go with someone that has been a friend of the pod for a couple of years now. Someone that we all met online, and I would say is one of the funniest people we have on the podcast consistently, and that is Boocanan. So let's hear what Boocanan has to say for this episode.
Oh my god, it's me, Boocanan, on the computer. Happy 10 years to Indieheads. Yay! I think my favorite album from a member of the Indieheads podcast in the 10 years that it has been a part of everybody's lives, my beautiful, darling friend Jackie, DJ Horse Jeans, came on my and Alexis's podcast, Hot Singles, to yell at us about Hood, Cold House. And I'm looking at the runtime for the episode here, and it says we went like 3 hours. So at least 8 hours of that was dedicated to Jackie hood-splaining us. And I remember thinking, like, she was right. Like, the record was just that fucking good. And I think that speaks to everybody at Indieheads' ability to get very violently excited about things that are both awesome and that are both incredibly terrible. I don't know if anybody listening to this right now is in the Indieheads Discord, but there was like going on like 2 to 3 years that there was just Big Bopper posting. I can't even fucking tell you what we're on now. I wanted to say it's much love to my dear sweet friend Jackie Goodrex and the Indieheads podcast, and you, listeners at home. Congrats on 10 beautiful, beautiful years, and let's hope for 10 more, because this shit's gonna be fucking awesome. And let's hope for 10 more years where I get to come on the pod and just ruin everything because I'm really young and stupid. Yay!
Look, they do be calling her Jackie Goodrex for a reason, folks, because her name is Jacqueline, and she's full of good recommendations. But yes, Boocanan, love to ya. Kissy noises. Remember when we used to do that a bunch? God. Anyways, speaking of Jackie, I think it's appropriate to have her up next on this episode since she was just shouted out. And just to spoil what comes after, you know what? We'll also throw in Alexis after Jackie too. So we'll just play those two back to back and see if they match up or not. All right, let's hear from Jackie.
Hello, it's Jackie, aka DJ Horse Jeans, calling into the 10th anniversary of the Indieheads podcast, she says, not quite being able to believe it. Wow. What a run. Perhaps some might say an golden era of podcasting. This has really sent me into a time warp thinking about this, thinking about how long it's been, thinking about the long arc between me joining the podcast 10 years ago, where my life is at now. And it's pretty crazy. And so when I was given the prompt of what album from the time that we've been doing the podcast, what's your favorite album? First of all, the answer is easy because I'm boring and it's Frank Ocean, duh. But I actually was okay with that because I do think that Frank Ocean's Blonde is a great record for me to talk about for these exact purposes. One, it's an album about the trap of nostalgia and the past and exactly what we're doing right now. Two, this album is the one. I think there's a couple of other things I have memories of in this category, but before I joined the Indieheads podcast, I was a listener of the Indieheads podcast. I was a mutual of Matty's on Twitter, a fellow rap forum veteran, as we've discussed on those episodes. But Matty and I were just friends. He was just someone whose opinions I liked, and I liked his little jokes, and we were buddies, but not like close friends. And he had started a podcast with some other people, and I started listening because this was around the time I was becoming like a diseased habitual podcast listener myself. So I was like, sure, I'll check this out. And I quite enjoyed it. And the real big things that I remember from my time my brief time listening to the podcast without being a member of the podcast is A, the great currents debate. B, I vaguely remember, like, I think Animal Collective Painting With came out in that time frame, I want to say. Before I was like, oh, what's this Animal Collective group about? Turns out that would become a whole thing with me on this podcast. And most importantly, I have a very distinct memory, like I can tell you where I was on campus memory of listening to the album discussion of Channel Orange, Jesus Christ, I fucked it up already, of Blonde. I believe it was for one of the Album of the Year episodes from that year, so not like right when it came out, but we were doing our Album of the Year, and Blonde was ranked highly, as it should be, and at the end of the year, listening to the podcast chat about it, and I was like, this is pretty good. But what if I was also on it? Right? Like, what if I was a part of this conversation? A thing I think embarrassingly often when I listen to podcasts is, ooh, I wish I could say my point I have right now. Ooh. But the Indieheads podcast is the only time I have successfully infiltrated a podcast that I liked listening to. And not only has that been fun in that you all have had to listen to me share my opinions about music, which is what I've always wanted, but the real thing is these people that this podcast has introduced me to have fundamentally and profoundly changed my life for the better in so many different ways. It's pretty hard not to get sappy when the first person you ever came out to as trans, Lily, is part of the podcast, when Matty, the person that got me a job and was my buddy for many nights at the drawing room during his time in Los Angeles, that Rose and Natalie, two of my other dearest friends, like, oh my God, just thinking about everyone that I know through this podcast and how much this podcast has like been the thing that connects pretty much everything I'm doing in my life now, from like the stuff I've done with Echo Astral to the stuff that I've done. It's just, it all everything's coming up Marty. I keep coming back and everything's just coming up Marty Monroe. Like, all roads lead back to this podcast. And there's truly, like, no way for me to properly thank everyone involved for how lovely and sweet that they've been to me and the world that has opened up to me through having this outlet and just being there for me at times I've needed it. Like, these are my fucking people. I love this podcast so much, even when I do not understand what the hell y'all are talking about, which is happening more and more recently as I try to get a life. But God, I've just had a really great time over these last however many years talking music, and I couldn't think of a better way to reflect on that than to ask the question, how many years is a light year? You know, is it future or is it past? As I love to say from Twin Peaks. Ever seen that show, Twin Peaks? Pretty good. All right, I'm not gonna do any more bits or tangents or digressions. But my favorite album of this time, it's Frank Ocean's Blonde. It's the most important album ever made, ? You be the judge. But it means so much to me. If you read my coming out letter, you know how much Frank Ocean and this particular period of time is. But, like, in addition to being a lens through which I have explored myself and my feelings and something I love very dearly, it also is something I do tie to me becoming a part of this podcast, me going on this journey that I did not know where it would lead me. And yeah, so that's why I picked Frank Ocean's Blonde. Would be cool if he put out music, but I'm not holding my breath. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Matty. Thank you to the OG Indieheads crew, Alex, Jero, etc., other people. DJ Horseshean's out. Bye.
Folks, they're calling me the Great Connector. They're calling me the Great Connector of people on podcast. But no, for real. Even if the pick is not surprising whatsoever, I mean, like, come on, like that's Jackie. Duh. Of course she's gonna pick blonde. Because why wouldn't you pick blonde? Duh. But yeah, that was very, very sweet. And of course, we had Boocanan before that, and of course, Jackie is a frequent guest of Hot Singles. Which, by the way, Boo and Alexis, if you are listening and if you are planning on bringing the podcast back, please have me. I would love to be on Hot Singles. Aside from my brief cameo, which I think got cut, where I made a 9/11 joke, or Boo made a 9/11 joke, and it broke me. Anyway, speaking of Hot Singles, let's go with Alexis. So, hey, Alexis, what do you got to say?
Hey everyone, it's Alexis from Hot Singles, coming with a little transmission about Indieheads at this wonderful, wonderful anniversary. I've only relatively recently become both a regular listener and part of the gang of contributors, and it's been an absolute pleasure, just a complete and utter joy to become part of the gang, part of the community, learn about so much fucking great music, bounce off everyone else's taste, and also find a little space in everyone's heart as the one making obnoxious comments about EQs and snares and all that bullshit. I endeavour to, give honest, good criticism, and most of the time I sound like a fucking moron when I do it, so, might as well stick to what I know. 3 records stand out as candidates for this pick of, albums that Indieheads has really gifted me in the time I've been in and around it. In bronze medal position, entirely thanks to Lily's conversation with us on Hot Singles, was figuring out how to listen to and feel through Callie Malone through our conversation about Living Torch, which is a beautiful, extraordinary, and intense record that needed, time to be digested entirely, through that conversation. And it's an absolute gift that now I can just,
have so much of both her music and music like it just at my fingertips because, we worked it out together. The runner-up for this is Suntub, which I would not have gone back to if Matty hadn't championed it so hard. And it's just been an absolute fucking godsend this year. I missed it when it came out, and it took some time and some reconsideration, but it is genuinely one of the greatest things I've heard this decade so far, like, without a shadow of a doubt. The winner, however, is something slightly less absolutely celebrated, but has given me one of the most incredible live experiences I've had this year. And one of the most wonderful, just like very straightforward, like someone nailing what my taste is because they know who I am, because they've listened to me talk about the music I like. And that is Jackie recommending me Exit Simulation by Nisi Blues. Exit Simulation is a quiet, spacey, beautifully atmospheric record which manages to knit together the kind of dubby miserableism and threat that I love from, years of dubstep and horrible, destroyed post-punk with a kind of wondrously rich, like, finely textured and enlivened, like, jazz ensemble in the dark at midnight, like, soul R&B backbone. And I don't think I've heard very many things like it. Clearly, this is coming from a scene that is full of exciting shit right now. And getting tapped into it, just in a little part, is such a absolute gift. And I'm infinitely thankful. You are not going to hear a sing performance as assured and beautiful and fucking heart-wrenching. And you are not going to hear R&B, like, taken apart and put together back again more inventively. It is such a beautiful record. And I was so lucky to, at Rewire Festival in The Hague this year, see her play pretty much the entire album, front to back, in a beautiful, small Lutheran church in the center of the city. She was wearing an outfit suggesting she was about to summon eldritch creatures on a runway. A like bespoke design dress, insane lighting, insane acoustics, just an absolute, putting on a show in the most intense, gripping way while fully respecting the tone and emotional weight of the music she was playing. If you want more of her, she's on the Transo compilation. And that record just stands alone as one of the like coolest and most like perfectly formed debuts I've had in a really long time, and most like electrifying projects to keep coming back to in the winter. And I have kept coming back to it in the winter, and that is why it is my pick for album that Indieheads has gifted me. Like, for all the jokes and shit, like, just sometimes you get beautiful albums that break your heart, and this is a beautiful album that broke my heart. There's really not much more to it. Thank you so much for all the work you do. I'm so glad to be a part of it, and I hope I'm a part of it for a good while to come. If you want to hear more of me talking about music, as ever, you can find me on Twitter at Regression with 3 S's. Don't forget the third. You can find Hot Singles at exportord.io/Hot Singles. We have indeed been on hiatus because life stuff. It happens. We are just two people trying to talk about music. And sometimes it's hard and doesn't fit in your life. But we'll be back. We're recording an end of year episode, so look forward to that. May already be out by the time this is up. Otherwise, it'll be up very shortly. Take care, everyone. Very, very happy holidays. Very, very happy Annie to the Indieheads pod. And catch you very soon.
See, it's crazy that Alexis mentioned Suntub because, ironically enough, this episode is coming out on a Suntub Sunday. So just a really happy coincidence. But yeah, no, that record again. Every now and again, I will champion a record, and it is to deaf ears, right? To deaf ears, and sometimes I understand it. Sometimes I'm just like, what the fuck? What are you talking about? This one though, I'm very very glad that I caught the ML Book bug. That's what I'm about to say. The bug early with her in Suntub when it came out initially, and then seeing the way that the music community at large kind of latched onto that record was really, really amazing. But yeah, let's keep it moving. Of course, we have we got a few more people left to go. Let's go back to a cast member, and let's just get silly with it. Gavin sent in something, so I'm very excited and very afraid to see what Gavin had to say for this episode. So take it away, Gavin.
Hello, everyone. This is Gavin reporting live from a La Quinta Inn in beautiful Waco, Texas. Wow, 10 years of the Indieheads podcast. That's the accomplishment, baby. That's crazy. We've outlasted a lot of marriages. Some of you were probably born from a marriage that didn't last as long as this podcast has. That's wild. That's crazy. I wasn't there on day one. I was hired at the beginning of 2018 when Jeff Rosenstock put out the album Post, and they needed a Jeff Rosenstock head to come on and talk about it. And because I was, I guess, acquaintances with a lot of the people here. I wouldn't say I was friends with them yet. We all have become great friends, and I love doing this podcast with them. But I was brought on to talk about that shit and a lot of music that I'm embarrassed that I listen to. I've grown up a lot, Pat, since then. My top Spotify Wrapped artist was the Beatles. So that shows you where I'm at in life, and the evolution of this podcast in general, where we kind of don't talk about new stuff anymore. But that's the magic of this episode, where we kind of get to go back and be like, oh, this shit was important to me. So let's talk about something that was important to me. The year was 2020. I don't know if you know this, but some wild stuff happened that year. And of course, I'm referring to us talking about the Butt Rock number ones, talking about that type of music with Alex and Matty. I think it kept me sane straight up that year. That along with, of course, my beautiful fiance Taylor, who I could not live without. Really, really kept me sane during those years. And the album I will be selecting to talk about is Limp Bizkit Still Sucks from that same year. Maybe it was 2021. I didn't look it up. I don't care. Suck my ass. I actually didn't care about Limp Bizkit when I was a kid. My favorite artists were oh my god, Aquaman 2 was on TNT in this hotel, and it looks like fucking shit, dude. This is crazy. Everyone looks like a deep fake of themselves. This is wild. Limp Bizkit Still Sucks. I didn't care about Limp Bizkit when I was a kid. My favorite artists were the Beatles, and then eventually it was NoFX, and then, here I am, the man, 30 years later, whatever. It was nice to hear an old, funny man who everyone, growing up on video game forums, everyone told you Limp Bizkit was the worst shit ever and that you needed to listen to Hot Water Music. And then you grow up and you're like, oh, Hot Water Music made Sir Duke the worst song ever, and Limp Bizkit are self-aware and funny. So it was very validating that internet nerds who loved, I don't even know what games were popping around that time, but the little shitty games like Assassin's Creed or whatever were all wrong, and the people who liked to wear baggy jeans and shotgun cheap malt liquor, not malt liquor, you can't shotgun malt liquor, shotgunning a glass jar would be jar. Listen to me, I can't even talk. Sorry, Aquaman 2 is killing me. Limp Bizkit Still Sucks. I still listen to some cuts off this record. I still listen to a lot of it, actually. It's held up for me, maybe not for other people on this podcast. I feel blessed to be a part of it and to have friends who are on it, and the evolution of it. I love you for listening. Thank you so much. I can't believe people actually do this and listen to specifically the episodes I come up with that are always inside baseball, outside trash. But if you ask me, you need the trash. You don't look at the trash, you become Lucille Bluth, and that's a fate worse than death. So I'm going to keep it short. I'm going to say bye. I'm going to say thank you to Matty, who does so much work for this podcast, specifically editing, pretty much management. He's the guy, and he's the best. None of this happens without Matty, so I'm going to suck him off and say thank you, along with everyone else, but specifically Matty. I love you all. Thanks for listening. Bye. And also, if it came through, Matty, I could cut this out if it didn't come through. Here's a special guest that I specifically recruited for this episode, baby. He's the man, the myth, the legend. It's been a while since we heard from him, but he's going to talk about an album that he loved that came out this past decade. So take it away, Godfather.
Hey, Marty. What's cracking lacking, my brother? WWE Hall of Famer, the Godfather here. And Gavin, he reached out to me and he said, my friend and boss. He didn't just say friend. Didn't just say boss. He said, my friend and my boss. And I guess you spent the last 10 years hosting a music review podcast. And you guys are celebrating by asking a lot of celebrities or people of influence or just pimps like me what their favorite music was for the last, 10 decades? Or no, 10 years. It wasn't 10 decades. I'd be like, hey, I can even go back. No. 10 years isn't long for me, man. I'm stuck in the 80s, believe it or not, 80s country music. So I'm a big fan of the Willie Nelsons and the Waylon Jennings and the David Allen Coles and the Merle Haggards and the George Jones and those. Believe it or not, I still listen to that stuff. But now, the more Sturgill Simpson, Creed Fisher. I know you're expecting probably something on the rap level, but I've got an old country soul. So I hope that helps you, man. And like I said, congratulations on the last 10 years. Keep it pimping, my brother. And it's time once again for everybody, including my man Marty, to come aboard the whole train. Keep it pimping, my brother. Peace.
Thank you. Thank you, Gavin, and thank you to the Godfather. Thank you both. And once again, we must remind everybody, congratulations to Indieheads podcast Song of the Year winner, Limp Bizkit, who won, I believe, our 2021 Song of the Year. They won our 2021 Song of the Year list with the track Dad Vibes, which I was actually kind of happy. I was, this year in particular is the first year in a while where a joke song, which this is no insult to Smokey Robinson. We love Smokey Robinson here on the Indie Hits podcast, but that was kind of a joke pick. Sorry, Violet and Gavin for saying that, but it was kind of weird to have a year where, like, oh shit, like our song of the year is like just like a normal indie song, just something that we all really, really, really liked. Jordy Creep, like that was that was that. But yeah, thank you, Gavin. Thank you, Godfather, and even if Godfather didn't totally follow the prompt, it's the Godfather. He's not as plugged in as the rest of us. I can't blame him. But yeah, let's keep it moving. Let's go once again to another friend of the pod, and we got a couple people that we could go with, but in this case, I'm gonna go with Marcy Anime, as I actually believe she's one of the last ones we have here on the docket. So let's hear from Marcy Anime and see how she answered the question.
Hey guys, this is Marcy, otherwise known as Marcy Anime or Marcy Cat, depending on of what you want to say to me, because honestly either is like really cool and fine. As someone who's guested on this podcast like twice, I think, which is not very frequent, but I am pretty happy about giving Matty the Brainworms that is MTH by SVRL good track. Still love that thing. As it so happens, I do actually listen to music. which might not always be very apparent, but it is in fact the case. I think I'm supposed to pick some albums here. Albums from the pod that they talked about. So I have 2 records here. I have a record that I discovered myself through like the past decade, and one through the pod. So first record here. So I would have gone drunk for this. Thundercat by Drunk. That would be my usual go-to, but I think just as of late, I gotta say, I can't really stop thinking about Wall Socket by Underscores. Every time I hear that record or any song off of it, I just am continually impressed by it and its songwriting and just how self-contained everything in that album is. I really do feel it's some kind of generational record to me, which is, it hasn't got a lot of press. It's not been covered by Pitchfork, or I think it got a Fantano review or whatever, but like, I just see how that record moves people and moves people I know. Like, that it's the kind of record that is hitting exactly the kind of people it needs to. It's not in the same kind of way since, like, I see whenever, I don't know, anytime Porter drops a record, it sends shivers down, like, every teenager with a copy of Ableton that I know. For better or for worse, I guess. So yeah, that's one for me. And I'll say one from the pod, and just from the server, I guess. I was so not every record that my fellow co-hosts here, I say my fellow co-hosts, I'm not even on the damn pod. But anyway, so I was so ready to be doubtful about this MJ Lenderman guy, because he got so hyped up by everyone in the server, and critically acclaimed it all, and I was just so doubtful for some reason, because not everything is my kind of thing. This indie rock thing does not tend to be my bag when it comes to indie music, I guess. But I did my due diligence, and I wanted to hear the record, and so I did, and turns out, damn, everyone else was like right the whole time. It's in fact a very good record. Wow, who would have thunk it? I could just like listen to people sometimes, because they might be right about stuff, as it turns out. So I will pass this on to everyone else. Manning Fireworks by MJ Lenderman. Very good record. Both songs also, and back to that one, also very good. Y'all were right the whole time. Wow. So yeah, those are my picks there. As someone who's only been a recent listener from all the fun little series that happens on the pod, whether it's a car commercial number ones or a 90s alternative number ones, or Five Moron versus Maroon 5, I love that shit, and I'm sure that's how most people got into this whole shebang. Oh, also, how could I forget Pod Hero? Of course. A series based off one of my favorite game franchises of all time. Very great. Thank you, Natalie, for putting it all together. Thanks so much. So I will say hats off to all the lovely people I've met through the server in the podcast. Y'all have done a great service, and also for some reason let me on the podcast as well. Yeah, great job, guys. Also, letting my girlfriend Alexis and the homie boocanan on the pod as well. Love those episodes. They have very funny and smart things to say about music. And also listen to their podcast, Hot Singles, which I've also guested on a number of times. Very good pod. We say lots of smart things. We're the smartest people to talk about music ever, I think, actually. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up now. I've been talking for too long. Hats off to 10 years of Indieheads podcasts, and let's hear it for 20 more years. That's right, guys. You're gonna do this thing until your 40s. I'm sure y'all would love that. Anyway, this is Marcy Cat signing off. Nya and nya and nya. I'm a cat, and then this is this is me. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Marcy, for the kind words. And originally this was just going to go straight to me, but as I'm recording this, we got a very last minute transmission, and one that I'm very glad that we got. Shamir, our good friend Shamir, long time, has been a guest on the podcast a number of times over the years. It's funny that we're having Shamir go up next, because the album I'm talking about is from an artist that Shamir worked with and produced and invited onto the podcast, and we then made him talk about the worst Maroon 5 shit in the world, and it was, oh my god. But anyways, yes, Shamir is up next, so I'm very excited to hear this myself. So hey, let's hear it from Shamir.
Hiya, this is Shamir, and I just want to say, happy anniversary to the Indieheads podcast. Everyone knows that I am a huge fan and love to be a part anytime that I can be. But you know what? I actually don't have a favorite album to talk about for this. I hope that's fine. Everyone knows I like to shake it up. But I want to just talk about the time that I did the very special episode about Keen and their music discography, and how that was very eye-opening for me. And by the end of that episode and the end of the playlist, and after even listening, a bit more to Keen aside from the hits by myself, I had the glaring realization that I think they might be better than Coldplay. So that was a big one for me. And yeah, if it wasn't for the Indieheads podcast, I wouldn't have had that revelation. So shout out Keen, shout out Indieheads, and keep on rocking the free world.
Thank you very much, Shamir. I do not mind you bending the rules at all for the pick there. Again, always glad to hear that the podcast has changed minds and opened things up for people, to appreciate music that maybe wasn't either appreciated enough in its time, or just a whole we're able to kind of put things into a new context, like Pink Chocolate. We can put that into a new context, but we're not talking about Pink Chocolate. We're not talking about J Bigo. We're talking about favorite albums. And last but not least, I'm up next. So, hey, let's hear it from me. Hello, it's Matty Monroe, the host and founder of the Indieheads podcast. I started the podcast as the day this comes out on patreon.com/Indieheads podcast. It'll be 10 years to the day that we uploaded our first episode onto YouTube. And I wish I had a better memory for like how the podcast started and all that. But here's the thing. I'm recording this one a little bit in advance of me doing the edit. So I probably already talked about the origins of the podcast a little bit in that 10 year. And we also kind of did that in the 200. So I will not belay the point. Basically, the question that I posed to everybody, as you all heard, was what is your favorite album released since we began as a podcast that ideally is an album you discovered because of the podcast and the people on it and in the community? And I had a bit of a tough time deciding on an album because there's a couple records that immediately come to mind but are not eligible. The Redeemer and Black Metal, both those came out before December 22nd, 2014. So can't count those. Is there any other Dean Blunt releases? I love Black Metal too. It's one of my all-time favorites, but is it, my favorite album released in that 10-year period? I don't think it is. Others, obviously, then Joyce Manor. What about Joyce Manor? Well, their best two albums also came out before the podcast existed. So again, can't really count that. And there's a couple others, Because the Internet, Childish Gambino. And then I look to my best of the decade list, my best of the 2010s, and the album that topped that list at the time, I believe, let me see, I'm going through it real quick, was of course The Redeemer, but in second place was Lamelda Thanks, which is a record that I love, and certainly I would say would be the number 2, number 3 of what I considered for this little segment here. But again, it just didn't feel right, and maybe it's recency bias, maybe it's something else, but once I really thought about it, the album that comes to mind to me of like, hey, what is my favorite record released in this little 10-year span? It's Strange Ranger, No Light in Heaven is my favorite album released in the last 10 years as of today. The last 10 years as of today. And it is a record that really Strange Ranger is a band that I discovered because of the Indieheads podcast. I can't remember who exactly it was. I want to say it's AJ Moser. So AJ, if you're listening, thank you for introducing me to this band. But that's my best guess that it's AJ, but maybe there's somebody else. But nevertheless, I discovered Strange Ranger in 2018, 2019 as AJ Moser and some other folks in the Indiehead sphere. We're talking about the record they released that year, which let me pull it up because I'm bad with names. Remembering the Rockets, which at the time I thought was a fine record. I think I saw them open for Joyce Manor that year, and they were solid. Nothing super memorable, but they were solid. And this is during a period where it sucks, where this is a period where I was like not recording shows. For some reason, I was like, I don't want to record shows. I don't want to document the stuff, which in retrospect, really fucking stupid. I like to be able to look back and have memories on that stuff. So there's like a slice there where I just wasn't recording anything. Huge bummer. Maybe one of the good things about social media is me like wanting to actively record segments of shows so I can have, more of a more strong memory, but that being said, saw them in 2019, thought they were fine. Thought the record at the time was solid, but at the time to me, just nothing remarkable. And then, 2021 hits and it comes out in October of 2021, October 22nd of 2021. And at this time, I had just moved to LA, and I was in the office. And I think at this point, it was a pretty solid crew at that point. Let's see, it was me, our good friend Luke Phillips. I think Jackie at the time was working there, so we had a solid crew of people. And I want to say I think I had control of the aux, and threw this on the office, and just immediately was like, whoa, like. Even through like the shitty office speakers, I knew that I heard something that was like, oh, this is kind of unbelievable. So I immediately like go and play it again on my headphones. Like I gotta re-listen to this. Like, holy shit, what is this? And at the time, this record was getting kind of dogged with Spear of the Beehive comparisons, as this was the same year that Entertainment Death had come out, and so that record was very fresh on people's minds, being like, hey, this is kind of a Spirit of the Beehive ripoff, which, at the time I kind of agreed to, because here's the thing, my number one record at the time in 2021 was Spirit of the Beehive, Entertainment Death, and that was what was listed as my number one record when I put it together, my year-end list. But then by the end of December, I was like, oh, I fucked up. Like, this album should be number one on my list. And, in the, over 3 years since it's come out, it's just continued to grow, in my mind. I still think this is such an amazing, fantastic record that does take me back to a very specific time in my life, obviously, when I just moved to LA. And this is just and I think that's probably one of the main reasons it holds such significance to me, is that it came out during like a very just hectic time in my life, just a time in my life that is just forever etched onto my brain. But even then, when I think about this record, when I talk about this record, I love how cohesive it is. It does, it is a mixtape, but it's really the thing about it being a mixtape is more just like, well, we have all these ideas as a band that we want to do that are not really the things that people expect from us, and so we're just going to throw it all out there. And even if it's kind of jumbled, they're able to really, put together these very like separate pieces in a way that is very cohesive and very much like of one piece. Nothing on this album feels out of place in the slightest. You have little bits of like, what sound like found samples. You have sort of, 80s new wave kind of inspired stuff. You have obviously the psychedelic, borderline shoegaze, very production heavy stuff that obviously Spear of the Beehive was doing around the same time. Then you have very like earnest indie rock, very much in the early alt rock days, when college radio kind of reigned supreme over alt rock before grunge really took things over. And obviously you have dance music, you have, bits of techno and house thrown in the mix. It's, this band that kind of came up as like an emo band who kind of made the transition to indie rock. Turns out their horizons are much more than that. It's such an ambitious record, I get why they call it a mixtape, and I think I love that my favorite album of the last 10 years is a mixtape. I really, really do miss the mixtape as a format. I do think more bands should incorporate it, should be like, hey, use that term more often. Don't call it an EP, don't call it a playlist, call it a fucking mixtape. Like some of the best, records of the 2010s, of my youth are considered mixtape. Stuff like Ex-Military, that's technically a mixtape, and it's one of my favorite records of all time. And again, also Death Grips, I had to consider the powers that be, but the one that I like the most came out before the podcast. So that being said, I'm getting lost in thought here. And really one of the rewarding things with this record was that, I was able to meet the people that made it. I was able to have really productive conversations with them. Obviously, one of my, a really great episode that I think more people should listen to is the FYC episode that I did with Isaac. I was able to kind of strike up a little bit of a friendship with him. And, they put out a great record in 2023, Pure Music. At the time, it was my number one. But ironically enough, very, very similar to how it went down in 2021, where Spear the Beehive was my number one at the time. And then, realized it was actually Strange Ranger. Strange Ranger was my number one at the time in 2023. And then over time, I realized, it's actually in my book. It's actually in my book. Fuck. But that doesn't take away from how great Pure Music is. And, as much as I love Pure Music, it is very much a record that is bound to some expectations. It is like, okay, we are making this big, ambitious record, and it sounds like it. And it is, more of an album. It's an album, right? And this, it's so loose and free, but that doesn't take away from the ambitiousness of it all and just how cohesively it comes together and just how it makes me feel, like an important thing too with this record coming out is that like this was the soundtrack of my breakup. I was in a long-term relationship at the time that this record had come out. It was a long distance relationship that I was starting to kind of feel, like things were starting to fall apart in that relationship. And this was the soundtrack of me realizing that like, hey, things were falling apart in this relationship and, wanting to figure out like, well, how do can I put this back together? Is it worth putting back together? Like, what should I do with my life? And so, really for, over a year and a half, as I was kind of figuring out what to do and then, discovering who I was outside of this relationship, this was the soundtrack to that. This is a record that helped me discover myself. Like, I feel like this is the record where I wouldn't say like, obviously, like I've been an adult since I've been 18 years old, but I do feel like this is the record that marks for me the transition point for where I went from a young adult to an adult, right? And I do think the records like that are important. Obviously when we talk about sometimes our favorite records of all time and stuff like that, it's stuff that calls back to our youth, our teenage years, or even like our college years. And for me, this record's kind of interesting because this record marks the end of that era for me. And you would think that I would have a negative association being like, oh, this is the, the sound of my youth going away. But I feel like with this generation and this generation in particular, I feel like with a lot of us within the Indieheads podcast, I don't think we look back on our youth as a great time. If anything, our youth was some of the worst times of our life. And, coming into proper adulthood is actually where we find ourselves and where we kind of feel like, hey, I am the person that I'm meant to be. And this record soundtracks that for me. But, yeah. But I'm a shpiel a little bit. I'll get on some particular tracks. Obviously, In Hell is fucking amazing. What a killer way to open the album. Basically, immediately alienating anyone that is not a sicko, being like, "Hey, Strange Ranger, remember this band? We're kind of emo, kind of indie rock. Here is this fucking like." It is such a gatekeeping intro. It's like, hey, if you can't handle this, then you're not handling the rest of the fucking record. But obviously, Pass You By is such a great synth pop song. Needing You is a fucking jam. Cheap Returns, Back to My Home. Oh my God, the way that it makes a transition is very reminiscent of this little Ugly Mane track that he put out in like 2012, 2013. It's kind of a Lucy in his discography, but it has a very similar way where it kind of becomes something else in the second half, but it still feels like very, very connected at the end of the day. Let me see. Is it even in my iTunes? I believe it's on his Spotify. So listeners, I'm doing this all off the cuff. I wrote no notes, if you can't tell already. No notes. I just wanted to go do this off the cuff because that feels the most honest to me to do this off the cuff. Passion Scepter, Dirt Mystery. Very reminiscent of that track. Kind of feels like the indie rock version of that song. Yeah, I don't know. I just love this record so much. So yeah, in the last 10 years of the Indieheads podcast, my favorite album in that interim period is No Light in Heaven by Strange Ranger. Well, folks, there we have it. That is all the transmissions that I had for this episode. So I guess let's just end it off, and I'll talk about what reflect on the last 10 years of the Indieheads podcast, kind of where we started, where we went, and I guess where we're going from here. I kind of talked about some of the stuff during episode 200, but yeah, no, like I did not think that we would last this long. Like, I won't talk about too much about the origins as it's been discussed, like, hey, we all met on the Indieheads subreddit. I put out a call. A number of people answered that call, threw them all into a Skype chat. Some very quickly dipped out, and some stuck around as we kind of were doing the podcast pretty consistently for about, I would say, like, not every week, but like we would probably have an episode at least like once or twice every month for a couple years there. And then I would say sometime around like 2018, 2019-ish, or early 2019 for sure, we kind of just like stopped. I think I don't recall off the top of my head, but I want to say that there was a solid months long gap where we just didn't put out any new episodes. Like, we were just kind of like, we just couldn't really agree on times, and, stuff wasn't inspiring. But yeah, no, like we just couldn't agree to get episodes out there, which was a really big bummer. But eventually we kind of found our way back into doing the podcast regularly. Obviously, it helped that we were working on doing our best of the 2010s, or our best of the decade list, and we brought on some fresh blood. Brought in some people that at the time were early cast members, but just didn't work out initially for one reason or another. Brought them back into the fold, and things worked out really well from there. And I guess that injection of fresh blood was enough for us to kind of go, hey, let's just keep moving, And then throughout 2019 and 2020, we were pretty regularly putting out stuff. We had the Indieheads retrospect episode on Currents that I think is a really good episode. Although I went to re-listen to parts of it. I'm like, oh God, this was at the point where I was not quite editing just yet. And I really, again, this podcast, it's been a constant struggle really for the last, 4 or 5 years of trying to make this podcast sound as good as it possibly can, but dealing with like so many different errors when it comes to recording, across the country, and everyone has different equipment and whatnot. That's a whole other spiel. But yeah, just doing the podcast, throughout 2020, and having some really good fun episodes, bringing on some guests that we've been wanting to bring on for a long time. I think like Chris Farron was on the podcast in 2019 as on what was essentially a proto version of the car commercial number ones, where I was just like, hey, here's what the alt charts look like right now, let's talk about them. And so that was sort of a proto version of what would become car commercial number ones, and really was just sort of a spin on an episode we would do quite often, which was a Billboard top 10 check-in, where every few months, if we just didn't have an episode idea, we would just go, hey, here's what the top 10 of the Billboard Hot 100 looks like right now, let's just talk about it. And that was very much like the format of the Bark Number Ones comes from that. And really the format really for what the podcast will become goes back to those episodes. But of course, as is well aware, 2020, I come up with an idea being like, hey, we should talk about all the Billboard number ones on the alt rock charts before 9/11. And we just had so much fun doing that episode. They're like, hey, let's just do the rest of the charts. And so that became a series, and that became really like the format of the podcast really from there on out. And that led to some playlist episodes, and brought us to car commercial number ones, and then 90s rock. But I really want to mention this because I do think this is left out in the history books, and I want to, maybe if Jake and or Alex are listening, I kind of hope this inspires them to pick the series back up, because I'm happy to help out where I can. This Discog breakdown comes from Alex and Jake doing the Phil Elverum Discog breakdown, Mount Airy, the microphones. That's a series that was kind of left unfinished as other projects got in the way. But I would love for that series to finish, especially as we have a new Mount Airy album that came out this year. And I would love to hear Jake and Alex talk about that, and also just kind of get back on track with that series, because obviously that series leads into the Death Grips Discog breakdown, and the never released but was worked on the Animal Collective Discog breakdown. Like, that is a series that I would actually love to bring back when it makes sense. But just Discog breakdown in general. But obviously for that, Jake, Alex, please, I would love for more Phil Elverum Discog breakdown episodes if you ever want to pick that back up. But yeah, we had that, and then we had Butt Rock, and those two series were like the things that really kick things back into pace. Like, hey, we were back and we were working, and then once we got done with 90s rock, we had some stuff obviously between car commercial and 90s rock, but I really do feel like after 90s rock, that was just a really big boom period where, like, hey, we had all these really fantastic episodes. It's just some really fun episodes as we got to see people, we got to see Violet come, into her own and really become such a foundational member of the podcast, and, her and Gavin and myself and so many other people like really contribute so much creatively to the show that is, really, really amazing, right? And obviously that leads to Best New Pod with Jackie and Rose, and we get into some of our notable guys, Morgan Gainham. I'm going through the archives right now. Absol taught me how to think for myself. That's a great episode. Obviously, Rap Forum Veterans, same fucking song again. God, fucking busted. Jesus Christ. The revival of FYC, which again, FYC would love to bring that back at some point when it makes sense. Fucking Publix, and got the internet going nuts. Adult Entertainment Contemporary. Oh my God, just some really club songs to suck and fuck to. Jesus Christ. God. Just again, it just once I really from Butt Rock until now, I think it's just been and golden era of the Indieheads podcast. I really think that aside from a couple clunkers here and there, which is to be expected with our format, I think we've just been on a really amazing hot streak. And our podcast, there's times where I'm like, man, why isn't our podcast bigger? And then I remember some of the things that we talk about on the regular, and I'm like, it makes sense that things aren't popping off in a major way, but yeah, this year alone also, having Pod Hero and Best New Pod season 2, I think those are two of our best series that we've ever done, so. And again, we just got a lot of great stuff planned for 2025. Obviously, we have, after, we have a backlog of our normal numbered episodes that we have to get to. We have we have numbered episodes all the way until like basically the end of June that hopefully will lead into Pod Hero season 2 as we finally get to like Guitar Hero 3, and that's going to be fucking crazy when we get to those episodes. But Pod Hero season 3, and then whatever more numbered episodes we have from there, maybe some mini series and stuff like that. But yeah, 2025 is just going to be a great year for the Indieheads podcast as we now are past our 10-year point, and we shoot for 20. So yeah. Again, and listeners, as I said at the top, really all this is possible because of you, because like I said, like part of the reason why we stopped doing the podcast very often, throughout like 2018 into 2019 was the fact that we weren't really getting a lot of feedback. We were just kind of doing this for ourselves. And it wasn't really until the Butt Rock series and the Phil Elverum Discog breakdown that we were getting like regular feedback from people listening and, being like, we love the series, we love this. And like, that was encouraging for us to finally start the Patreon. And that obviously is been, beyond the monetary fuel, which is very, very important. So thank you for continuing to help keep this podcast happening on a monetary level, because hey, it ain't cheap. It ain't cheap and it ain't free. But beyond that, just seeing our community, our very active community, even if it's not a big one, it's a very small but dedicated audience that loves the podcast and wants it to keep going. And so we can't thank y'all enough for continuing to fuel the fire. But yeah, I'm just going to leave it there. Thank you all for listening to our 10-year anniversary episode. As next week, we've got our Album of the Year podcast as we talk about our top 10, maybe 11 albums of 2024. And yeah, that's our last episode of the year. And hopefully you enjoy that next week. But for right now, we'll see you later. Bye-bye.